Thank you for having me here at Lone Star College. Thank you for John Barr for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I have a lot to say tonight. So, first, religion and politics. What's the connection? Should there be a connection between religion and politics? As we've been told most of our lives, you keep those things separate, right? Your religion's over here and politics is over there. Except in the real world, it's not quite so simple. Part of the thing is that religion and politics are really operating today in the same space, the same public space, right? And they both are making claims. Religion is making a claim, a value claim about what is important in the world, how we're going to order our society, how we are going to include people or not include people. Then we also have politics that has a vision also of what kind of society we're going to have. So religion and politics at the core seem like they're competing with each other for ultimate values, for what is going to be, how are we going to organize our society. Some people say we should just be organized based on liberal political values. Other people who are religious want to say, no, we want our religious values to also be part of how we organize our society. And so that conflict, which is now happening in the public space that we live in, makes it virtually impossible to separate that. So if you tell me, your politics, I can pretty much figure out what your religion is going to be. And if you tell me your religion, I can pretty much tell you what your politics is going to be, because they're interlinked and you cannot separate them, even though we have been told since the Enlightenment, since about 200-300 years ago, that it was a good thing to separate these things and that they could be separated. So this is one of the challenges that we have in America today, because we actually have a political conflict, which everybody's very aware of. We've got people who support the president, President Trump, and his vision of what America should be. And then we also have another group of people who oppose him. And the country's pretty much split, 50-50. It's a very strong split, but it's not just a political split. What I'm saying today, that it's also a religious split at the core, that people are really hitching their politics to their religion and vice versa. So one of the things that we hear about now a lot is the idea of social justice. This word, social justice, is something that's actually been revitalized probably in the last 10 to 15 years. It had a heyday in the early 20th century with what is called the social gospel. The social gospel promoters also were talking about social justice. Then in the 1960s, we had another time when the language of social justice was very important. And then we've had this revitalization, and it started, I think, I would say probably very strongly in 2008 when Barack Obama was running. Obama was running for president, and when he ran for president, he was maligned in the press because he had attended the church that was the church of Jeremiah Wright. And Jeremiah Wright was a black liberationist pastor. He's very radical in his denouncement of the American system and how it treats black people and how it treats poor people. And he was associated with that pastor, and people on the right, people who opposed Jeremiah Wright, were very upset that we would possibly elect a president that was associated with black liberation theology. Okay, then we have 2013. In 2013, we have a new pope in the Vatican. Pope Francis invites Gustavo Gutierrez. Gustavo Gutierrez is a liberationist Catholic priest who, and I'll talk a little bit more about his background later, who in the 1960s was really advocating for a different kind of religion and reinterpreting Christianity in a new way. He is considered Marxist, which was in opposition to Catholic doctrine. He had a lot of enemies and a lot of people who didn't like him. So for decades, the Vatican pretty much distanced themselves from this Catholic priest, Gustavo Gutierrez, because he was a problem. He was a problem because of some of his ideas. He was a problem because he kind of got a lot of people riled up and got a lot of people to question the church. And so for decades, he was really a person non grata with the Catholic hierarchy. Pope Francis comes in 2013, and what does he do? He invites them to come to the Vatican. Well, when that happens, I mean, the media all over the world is going crazy. What's happening is Pope Francis a liberationist? Why is he inviting this liberationist? The people on the right are really angry because they think that it's totally inappropriate for the Pope to invite Gustavo Gutierrez to the Vatican. The people on the left, the Christian left, the Catholic left, are thrilled because they're thinking, finally, we're going to get a hearing with the Vatican with what our ideas are. So this is happening. Then in 2016, we have a new president, Donald Trump. And that even got people on the left, on the political left, much more riled up about social justice. And the Christian right, the religious left, also got galvanized because of Donald Trump to really press the social justice issue that they believe was fundamentally a religious issue, but that it was also something that had to be effective in the political realm, that it could not just be something that we talk about in our churches, that it had to be taken out into the streets. So that's sort of the background. And today we've got the Christian right, and we have evangelicals who are supporting President Trump for the most part, not all of them. And then we have the religious left, who is opposed to him, who have a different vision of a different kind of religious political vision of how the world should be. Now, this, if we want to look at what is the most recent, where did this come from, this split? It goes back hundreds of years, but one of the big points of culmination was the 1960s. The 1960s was a time when Black people were advocating for civil rights with Martin Luther King, and after he was assassinated, what happened? People became radicalized within the civil rights movement, and we have the emergence of what's called the Black Power movement. The Black Power movement usually has been thought of as being a secular movement, meaning a non-religious movement, a movement that was just a political movement. And you have that movement. And then we have women are out in the 1960s begin to advocate for their rights. They're beginning to say, wait a minute, we don't have full equality in this society. And they become also radicalized. And we have another movement that's coming out of feminism called the radical feminist movement, which is much more radical than just, hey, we want to vote or we want to drive or whatever the civil rights are. They want a total fundamental change in society and the way society is ordered and how we think about family and how we think about everything. They realize that politics, in terms of the very narrow liberal politics, it's really all about political rights, that was not sufficient to change society. Then in Latin America, what's happening there, in 1959, there was a Cuban Revolution, and the Cuban Revolution basically galvanized all of Latin America against American U.S. imperialism. The Cuban Revolution in 1959 was very much a revolution that was trying to sort of liberate itself from the power of the United States. The United States had a lot of control in Cuba in terms of the business, the economics, and Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, which were two revolutionaries, basically said, the problem that we have in Cuba, the reason we're poor, the reason we have all our problems is because the United States is controlling us, and we have to get away from this power. So the Cuban Revolution was successful in that it overthrew a dictator that had been supported by the United States government, and it also inspired revolutionary movements all over Latin America. So the 1960s was a revolutionary, chaotic time in Latin America with many, many groups of indigenous people, particularly indigenous people in the mountainsides, in small towns, in villages and cities. Workers were rising up, and the complaint was always sort of kind of the same. The reason that Latin America is considered backwards, the reason we're poor, the reason we have we're not able to get ahead or get anything is because the United States is continually on our back, controlling us, setting up dictators, basically sucking the lifeblood out of Latin America. In fact, there was a book that was written that was called the veins of the bleeding veins of Latin America. So it's basically the idea in the 1960s in Latin America was that the problems that Latin America was having were structural. They're based on a long-term centuries of colonialism, not only from Europe but also American colonialism in that continent. So we have these radical movements, and when we first look at them, you think feminist, black power, and Latin American revolutionary movements. They sound at first like they're just political movements. But what happened was that a lot of religious people, a lot of religious intellectuals, joined those movements. They said, you know what, you're right. What you're saying is right. What you're saying about what's happened to women, what's happened to black people, poor people, and labor, what you're saying is right. And what they did was, some of these people were theologians. They were people who had been trained in European seminaries, they'd been trained in American seminaries, and they'd been trained in very basic classical traditional theologies. And they began to question the theology because they said the reason people are poor, the reason that women are oppressed, the reason why black people are not free is because the religious system in the United States, I'm going to focus on that, in the United States is a system that is has accommodated a political power structure. In other words, the politics and the religion were together, and they had colluded basically in the belief system against, by keeping everybody else out. So these religious intellectuals began to kind of look at their theology, what they had been taught about God, what they had been taught about and what they had written about, what they thought about God, and they began to say, we have to change the way we think about God, because that is fundamental to how people are going to live in the world. And it is political. And they said, we don't believe that that religion can stay out of politics, or that religion is not involved in politics. They had all kinds of evidence that the fact was religion was really in bed with politics, and it was always for the detriment of the people who were marginalized. So that was their kind of rallying call. They began to write books and articles and to speak out, and that's where liberation theology was born. Some of the things that were said was that the American religion was offering a white male God who was up there somewhere in the sky, removed from the concerns of ordinary people, and that white male God had to be replaced. And we have people like Mary Daly, Mary Daly was a Catholic woman theologian who in the early 1960s had actually thought that she maybe could reform the Vatican and the Catholic Church in regard to women, but by 1970 she had concluded that the Vatican's not going to change. And so she rejected Christianity altogether, left the Catholic Church, and went a totally different way. But she had a partner in these ideas, and that was Rosemary Radford Ruther, another woman theologian. She was a Protestant who decided she wanted to stay within Christianity. She was going to stay within Christian theology, but she was going to redo it. Not just reform it, she wanted a revolution in theology, a whole different way of looking at God. Mary Daly said, if God is male, then the male is God. And women will never be free if they're in a religion where God is male. This is very revolutionary. It's revolutionary now, and it was really revolutionary back in the 1960s. And she was very much castigated for that because it was just too much to take. The idea that we think of God, that the established religion was thinking about God in male terms. And she said, it's not that anybody really thinks that God is a man, but we proceed and we talk and we use he language. And so we just reinforce male domination over women, because if God who is male is the biggest figure in the universe, what does that tell us about men in real life, and what does it tell us about women and their place in society? James Cone was an African American theologian who was very well trained, and he became very disenchanted and very upset with the whole idea of black power, because he said, I have nothing to say to black power people. My theology doesn't know how to talk to these people because they have a complaint that is very legitimate. And he came to the conclusion that the only way that black people could be free was to throw off the shackles of white religion, which means the idea of a white God. So he said, the most revolutionary thing he said was, God is black. God is black. God is not a white man. Okay? And he's a black. The reason God is black is because God is not just way up there, pie in the sky, transcendent, who doesn't care about anything. He's in the lives of black people. He is with them in their struggle. And he began to really look at black history, and he said, God has been there. That's the God that black people need. They don't need a white God to free them. They need a black God who's with them. And it's like, that was revolutionary, because nobody would have accepted that. They would have said, well, God is beyond race. He goes, no, if you say God is beyond race, you're really saying he's white, okay? That was code for white. And so he began to really present the idea that God was for black people. Then Gustavo Gutierrez, who was in Latin America, he said, God is for the oppressed. He is for poor people. Not only that God is like trying to help poor people, God actually prefers poor people. This idea that God is preferential is also another revolutionary idea, because the idea is everybody's equal before God, right? God treats everybody the same. He cares about everybody the same. He loves everybody. He said, no, he doesn't. He prefers poor people. And he showed people biblically in the Bible, and he showed people historically, God is for poor people. He prefers poor people. Therefore, we must have a religion that prefers poor people, that puts poor people first, that gives poor people their voice, that allows poor people to tell you who God is. All these guys and women, the black people, the black theologian James Cone, Mary Daly, Rosemary, Radford, Ruther, and Gustavo Gutierrez, all of them would say, we have to listen to the experiences of ordinary people. What do black people have to say about God? What do poor people have to say about God? What do women have to say about God? Because the God that we have right now formulated in our minds is a God that has been shaped, named by white men. Powerful white men, not just even any white man, but powerful white men, elite men. And that the only way we're going to have a full idea of who God is, if we're going to understand who God is, we have to understand how lots of different people experience God, and they have to speak for themselves. We're not going to tell them who God is. They're going to tell us who God is. Wow, I think that's pretty cool. Okay, so instead of us going to black people and saying, let me tell you about God, blah, 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 they're going to tell me about God. So the liberationists had a lot of history behind them. The 1960s was this critical moment, because there were so many things happening that, it just kind of came to fruition. But they had a long history, because if you look at the history of religion and politics in the United States, let's just take the 19th century, you have the abolitionists. Most of these abolitionists that we think about, the ones who wanted to do away with slavery, were religious people. They just didn't buy the established religion. They believed that God mandated the freedom of African American people. And they were fighting for that because they believed that that was the right thing to do. It was a political cause, but it was a religious cause also. They couldn't separate those things together. And most of the churches in the 19th century, if you walk to most churches, they would have told you that slavery was biblical. That's what God wanted. And they said no. Okay? And same thing happened with women. we think about women and the right to vote and the suffrage movement and women's getting just basic civil rights, being able to make contracts while they're married, to have their own property, to earn wages, married women to earn wages and keep their wages. Or even having rights over their children. The women who were the early suffrage movement, these were women who also believed that God, it wasn't just that they had a particular, that's just what they wanted. They believed that God wanted them to have these rights, that it was God ordained that women be equal to men, and that women have the same abilities and the same talents, that they could make decisions, and they had a good mind that God had given them. So, and at the same time, if you'd gone to any of the churches, most of the churches at that time, you would have not heard that. Most churches would have told you that women were to be submissive to their husbands, that they were to be at home, that the men were the ones that are in charge of society, that it was God-given to men to do this. So, but the women who were the suffragettes, the women who were trying to get rights for women, who were fighting for that, believed that their cause was a cause of religion. It wasn't just a political cause. So there you go with that. And we have other movements in the United States. We have labor movements in the United States and other political, what we consider political movements that were highly influenced by religious ideas, and people who were standing against the religious establishment, against what was the norm of what people thought religion was supposed to do. So we have two streams of religion in the United States. We have an established religion that has been dominant, has a particular view of God, a particular view of what social justice looked like, a particular view of how society should be organized. But we've always had, from the very beginning, we've had an alternative stream of religiosity, a different way of looking at God, a different way of thinking about how we're going to establish social justice. And that has always been working parallel with political movements, and you cannot separate them. So, when we reinterpret the Christian tradition and we begin to declare freedom for all because God is on the side of the poor, because God is black, because God is mother, not just father, that is going to upset a lot of people. A lot of people get upset. And what happened is, in the 1970s, or by the early 1970s, we have the rise of what we came to be known as the Christian right, which was a very conservative political movement that was a religious movement and a political movement. Before then, they didn't have to have a movement because the Christian right basically was already kind of in there with the main thing. They were the main thing, but all of a sudden they see a threat of radical religion, and they began to step up their efforts and say, hey, wait a minute. No, that is not the vision. That's not the Christian vision of society. The Christian vision of society that we are proposing is a vision of hierarchy, basically. It's a vision where women are under men, black people are under white people, poor people serve rich people. It's a religion of power, a religion it's a religion of power is basically what it is. So, the liberationists, when they began to formulate their ideas and really speak out and write their books, it seemed like, they're gonna achieve their goals, or they're gonna try to achieve their goals, but they didn't realize what they were doing too. At the same time, they were unleashing counterforces. Because every time you have a radical movement on one side, you're going to have another radical movement on the other side pushing back. It's never, and so here we are, in the middle of, 2019, and we have got a mess because we've got a split country, politically split country, religiously split. So it's almost untenable. And we can no longer think of religion and politics as being separate. There's just no way to think about it that way. And you can't even try to put the genie back in the bottle, okay? It's out. So, I started this session, I said, if you if you tell me your religious viewpoints, then I can pretty much tell you what your politics is going to be. And if you tell me your political viewpoints, I can pretty much tell you what your religious viewpoint is going to be, because they kind of go together. Is it right or wrong? Who knows? But I think we have a very good window by looking at history. We can look back at history and know that the major changes that have happened in America, in terms of black people being liberated from slavery, civil rights, women getting their rights, even we're talking about the New Deal and giving a safety net to elderly people and poor people, the welfare programs. All these movements that we consider progressive movements were turbocharged by religion. If you look deep enough, you're going to find there were religious people with convictions who believed that God wanted these things, and God demanded that our society be organized in a just way, that we couldn't just, keep our religion in the church. If it doesn't affect the rest of the world, they said your religion is useless. So every social movement, I believe, that has been effective in America, it's been effective because people have to believe in something greater than themselves. You can't keep a social movement going unless you can appeal to some higher thing, something transcendent, a God or something, an idea, something that's bigger than you. Because if it's just you and I here together fighting for whatever, we're going to run out of steam and we're going to get really tired. And that's my main concern right now with the United States. We have a lot of social upheaval. There's a lot of people who are very much motivated by a vision that includes something bigger than just our society, just bigger than ourselves. And it's about appealing to something that's greater. But if you don't have that, if it's just, we're going to go fight something, it's going to last about 2 days and it's going to fizzle out. And I think a lot of movements fizzle out because there's not a strong enough core something, a belief or something that keeps people going. And I'm not going to say what that necessarily needs to be for people, but we are religious people, we're political people, and we can't separate those things from each other. So we can no longer say keep those apart, because you're never going to be able to do it. Never have been able to do it. It's actually a myth of modernity, a myth of a liberal experiment to try to separate those two things. And all you end up doing is establishing a dominant religion and making that religion and that view of God the view that's going to hold. Okay, so I've said a lot. And I'm willing to answer some questions. I don't have the answers to everything, but I do, I can give you my best estimate of what the answer is. The question is, do I believe that religion still plays a big role in obtaining rights for black people and others? Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. You can look at the most recent movement. We've got the gay rights movement. There's a whole new theology of gay liberation, which is about saying basically that this idea that homosexuality is a sin is an erroneous reading of the Bible, and they have their own reading of the Bible, okay? And so they are also claiming that, God cannot be caged in into heteronormative sort of thing. So yeah, that's happening. I think there's still a lot of power within African American communities where religion plays a role. No, because I don't believe that. And the reason I don't believe that is because theology, which is the study of the Bible, the interpretation of the Bible, is done by human beings. And you can take 10 people in a room, they can read the same scripture and come up with 10 different interpretations, okay? So what the liberationists were claiming is that who's been reading the Bible? It's been white guys. Historically, it's been white guys. Elite men have been reading the Bible. And they have read it, and they have found certain things in the text that spoke to them, and it may be very well true, but it leaves a lot of life experience out. The experience of women, the experience of poor people, who may read the same text and come up with something completely different. No, I don't believe it's like that at all. I don't believe that.
Other questions?
Do you believe that in all of these revolutions for black people, like Black Lives Matter, and for gay people, gay rights movement, and for women and feminism, how much do you believe religion plays a very vital and essential part in achieving those goals of equality?
I think the biggest thing it does is it keeps movements going. Okay, and the radical feminist movement, for instance, has always been seen as a secular movement. But I've documented this. There's documentary evidence. There's tons of women who became feminist theologians, who they were Christian women, or they were Catholics. They had a faith. They went into the feminist movement because they believed the feminist movement was sort of a movement of God. They did. And once they got in there, it affected their theology. And then when they come out of the feminist movement, they bring with them those ideas, and they meld them, and they come together with their theology. I think it's there. I think it's in Black Lives Matter. I think it's in a lot of places. But you know what? We don't look for it. A lot of it is what gets reported, right? But it's there. Oh my goodness, I didn't know I had all these people over here, sorry.
Can environmentalism be used as an agent in liberation theology?
Absolutely. There's earth liberation, there's animal liberation. The original liberationist theologians of the 1960s, I just talked about in my book, Black and Latin American and feminists, but since then, in the 80s, 90s, and since there's been second and third and fourth generation liberation theologians who have gone into all kinds of areas where they see that theology needs to be rethought. How we look at the text, how does the text, the biblical text talks about animals, how the biblical text talks about the earth, you name it. They're coming into it and changing and looking at it differently.
Yes, how do you feel that President Bush's base face initiative program plays a part in religion and politics?
I didn't understand that question. Please say it again.
President Bush's faith-based initiative program.
Oh, well, the problem with usually when you have anybody in power like Bush or anybody else, or Trump or whoever, creating a faith-based initiative, it tends to be a very narrow definition of what qualifies, okay? And it tends to be established religion redone, okay, reasserted. So I'm not saying it's not all bad, I'm just saying I'm very suspicious when there's overt things like that, because I always think, okay, what religion exactly are they promoting?
Thank you. You've noticed that, or you mentioned that a lot of the social justice movements of the past have been anchored to religion and have seen momentum from religion. I've noticed with the growing field of 2020 candidates on the Democratic side that a lot of folks are no longer saying, with the exception of Kamala Harris, they're no longer saying God bless America or invoking religion in any way. In fact, secularism is sort of becoming the norm. Would you agree that that's happening? And if so, can we make a prediction about the future of the left? Will the left be parting from religion?
Okay, I've done some work on secularism. I have a sneaking suspicion that we can eliminate, I think one of the reasons they're eliminating a lot of religious talk from the politicians is because America is much more diverse religiously, okay? We're paying more attention to Muslim people, okay? And other pagan religious groups. Christianity is not as, entrenched as it once was, okay, because I'm a historian and I'm looking at the past. But the secularization thesis to me is kind of wrong-headed, because I think what's actually happening is religion has secularized itself. It hasn't been done to religion. Religion has now secularized itself by, let me see if I can explain this. I didn't talk about it. It has to do with the liberationists basically said that the transcendent, what we consider above or beyond, is in the immanent. It is in the now. It's in the everyday of the everyday. So that God, you don't have to talk about God out there, because God is right here. Okay? And that when you do that, you're collapsing two categories into one. And I think that's what we're seeing. The outcome of that is what looks like secularism. Okay? They don't have to talk about God to talk about God, okay? Because they're talking about values of how we are going to organize our society. What is justice? They talk about fairness. They talk about these transcendent values. And they don't have to say God for it to be, not be religious. That's a complicated question.
But I wanted to kind of piggyback on John, because the fastest growing religious group in America are people who have no religion at all. The nuns.
They have no formal
religion. So I wanted you, if you could, to maybe address that. Do y'all understand what I'm talking about? That there's no formal attachment to a church. And this, I think, is especially true with younger people. You all might be able to, well, you obviously can speak to that better than me. So if you could maybe fit that into what you're talking about, I'd appreciate it.
Right. There's more people who now are saying they're religious nuns, but it doesn't mean they don't believe in God. It doesn't mean they don't believe in some transcendent value. They may call it the universe or higher power or something else. They are rejecting institutional religion. They're rejecting the churches. They're suspicious of the theology, which actually is a kind of a fruit of liberationists, because liberationists question so strongly the established religion and the established theologies that the outcome is that a lot of us are suspicious. We don't buy it as much. We're much more critical of religion, the religious establishment. That doesn't mean that people don't have a religious sense in them, that they don't have a certain sense of what is a greater value. And they may call it God, they may call it the higher power. The language is expanded.
Other questions? Hold on.
Okay, so like a lot of lower developed countries and countries that are facing more poverty, famine, problems like that, tend to have a higher amount of religious affiliation. Why do you think the United States is an outlier, being that it has it's a more developed country with a high religious affiliation?
Okay, the question is, why is it that people in poor countries have a higher affiliation to religion? Is that
Why is the United States an outlier?
Yeah, why is the United States so highly developed and so rich, and yet it is a deeply religious country, whereas that seems to be different than what you see in other parts of the world where poorer countries tend to be more religious? That's the question, right?
Well, that's an economic and religion question. I have some ideas, but I don't feel like I could adequately address that, because you're talking about religion and economics, and lots of people are doing work on that, by the way, theology and economics and how they're related or not related. I wish I could answer that better, but I just...
In the days of the social gospel, 100 years ago, saying it more, there were a lot of Christian socialists who were part of that. The liberation theologians you're talking about, or many of them Christian socialists as well. And do you think the Pope is a Christian socialist? He's made some remarks that are pretty critical of capitalism. Of course, he would never use that phrase, but what's your feeling as to that?
Well, the thing about the liberationists is that some of them were outright Marxists. Some of them were socialists. Some, they had some flavor of socialism. You're right about that. In terms of, do I think the Pope is a socialist? I think that he has that impulse. Yeah, I do. I don't think he's a Marxist. I don't think he's a liberationist either. Okay. And so when he invites Gustavo Gutierrez into the Vatican, what was that? That was a pastoral move. He was trying to heal the breach between the conservative Catholics and the Catholic left, and bring the whole church together. Okay, that's what he was trying to do. And he was also doing a recovery of the old Catholic social vision. The Catholics have a social vision that goes back 100 years or more, that is not liberation theology, but it can look a lot like it. The difference is that in the Catholic social vision, it's mostly about encouraging well-off people to help the poor, to assist them, to be benevolent towards them, to be charitable. The liberationists said no, that's not it. It's not about helping poor people. It's about listening to them, letting them tell us who they are, who God is for them, and what they need. No, instead of us, more fortunate people coming in and saying, we're going to help you. It's not really about power sharing, it's about disinvestment of power, divestiture of power, which is much more radical.
All right. We'll take one more question after this one.
Do you think that there is a religious motive to the actions of Americans today, such as kneeling during the pledge?
Do I think that that's a religious action? Yeah, I do. Is that the question? Like if you kneel for the pledge as a sign as a protest, is that a religious action? Yeah, it is. Think about it.
What outcome do they expect religiously?
They basically, I think if you've really got to talk to them, I haven't gotten to talk to them, so I don't know. I can surmise that they probably believe that they're honoring God by standing up against injustice. That's how they're honoring God. And there's a lot of people in this country who will not say the Pledge of Allegiance, because for religious reasons, because they don't believe that they can give their allegiance to a country like the United States. That their allegiance is only to God and to justice.
Other questions? One more?
I'm wondering about your views on our penal system and our entrenched Puritanism and how it relates to politics. And, there's this thing about the president and his sins and how the religious right is so forgiving of his sins, but they see people in jail and there's no redemption for those. Do you have any?
I think that in terms of I don't study evangelicalism, I study radicals. And so the only thing I can say about the evangelical support of Donald Trump, I think it's a strategic, pragmatic support. I think that they know he's pretty bad, but they don't care because they're going to get what they want. They're bargaining with the devil. They know it, but they'll do it anyway because they feel like they might get more what they want. Like, Supreme Court justices and things like that, which is very critical to them for the decisions that they want overturned.
Okay, we actually do have one more right here.
I was just wondering because I know that there's images out there of the cloth that in Christianity supposedly that Jesus Christ got wrapped in. Do you
You mean the Shroud of Turin and all that?
Yes, ma'am.
Uh-huh.
I was just wondering, because I haven't seen it myself, but because there's a supposed image of who Jesus Christ really was in that cloth, do you still think that portray of what Jesus really was.
Oh, like what race, or because he was male and that sort of thing? Well, you're asking a deep theological question. I haven't really spent much time on that. But I can tell you that the liberationists really spend a lot of time talking about God in very inclusive terms, that God was much more than we've defined him.